members, and I'm sorry, while I'm reading this, Shannon, if you can check and promote people who you see. Good afternoon, welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Care Court Grants Committee. Thank you for joining us. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please use the raised hand feature. Please utilize this tool to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. A friendly reminder that this is a video conference and to please be aware of your surroundings behind you. All Legal Services Trust Fund Commission and committee meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar website. Zoom captioning is available. To enable, select live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom screen, then select enable auto transcription. All right, and I see we have some folks joining. So hi, Jody. Hi, Lauren. Hi, Helen. Eric and Shannon, I believe for a quorum, we need, let me count, 1, 2, 6, 7. We need 4. So I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, and Efrain makes 4 committee members. So we do have a quorum, so we can take votes.
I work here. So
and then Judge Klein.
Like,
hold on one second. Okay.
Do you know, who do you
Can
think is your best?
Chris, I sent you an email because I ended up going to a different place. Can I stay in this meeting or not?
I don't think you can.
Okay. In other words, if I don't vote and if no one showed up in the lobby, I'm still out.
You're still out. I'm so sorry. And that is truly a Bagley Keene open. That is not a State Bar preference.
I'm not
we obviously want you so badly to be in this
meeting,
but
please, I'm not taking it personally. I
okay.
just realized I switched addresses and didn't realize that just what I said, that I went to the other office to combine with the meeting, and then I saw that email and went, whoops.
I so appreciate you. It's
right.
I totally understand, Judge Klein. I so appreciate you checking. What we can do though is send you back to being a member of the public if you want to listen in, and you can do other work, and you kind of know what's happening. But yeah,
I can be a public participant.
You can, unfortunately we'll have to remove your panelist status, but yes.
I'll listen for a while, sure.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Judge Klein. I'm
and I'll be muted also, right?
Yes,
well, I guess I can speak as a public member.
I was going to say,
if you'd
Judge,
like to raise your hand.
Don't take up all the public comment.
Yeah, if you want to raise your hand and make a public comment, we can, at the chair's discretion, we can allow you to make a public
comment. All right. So you just take me out as a panelist, all right?
We'll do, yeah, I'll let Shannon.
And I'll be muted, correct?
Correct.
All right.
Okay, hey, Chris, so we're under a little bit of time pressure today, so let's kind of get going with roll call, if that's the next item that we need to do.
Perfect. And I see that we also have Commissioner Campbell. So I will begin with the roll. Moment. Okay. Iskin.
Sorry?
Oh, I said, just beginning with the chair, Iskin.
Yeah, here.
Blakemore.
Yes, here.
Escobedo.
Here.
Commissioner Morales. We knew would be unable to join. Shannon, if you see Commissioner Morales in the attendee pool, she said she also might call in like Judge Klein just to listen, but was unable to join from her noticed location, so shouldn't be a panelist. Okay. Campbell.
Here.
Klein is listening as a member of the public. And then Commissioner Pryor.
Here.
Wonderful. We do have quorum, Eric. I'm going to go ahead and do roll for staff members and liaisons. Selena Copeland from LAC. No, but I do see Lauren Klein. Hi, Lauren.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Laura Brown from the Judicial Council.
Hi. And Melanie might be joining late.
Oh, great. Thank you, Laura. State Bar staff. We would have Dwan Nguyen, I don't see on here yet. Chris McConkey is here. We may have Brady on call, but I see Helen Yu, who'll be taking the minutes, and Shannon Crossley. Okay, that completes the roll, Eric.
Okay, let's move on to the approval or any discussion of the minutes of the last meeting. I mean,
Wonderful. And would you like to hold?
I'm going to skip over public comment for a minute, for a little while.
Okay.
Any comment on the minutes?
There's no comments. I'm happy to make a motion to approve them.
Second.
Thank you. And I'll take the vote in just one moment. My spreadsheet is loading slowly. Okay. So was that moved by Commissioner Escobedo and, or I'm sorry, it was Blakemore and seconded by Escobedo? Oops, 1 second. Thank you for your patience. All right. Iskin,
Yes.
Blakemore,
Yes.
Campbell,
Yes.
Escobedo,
Yes.
Morales, absent, Klein, attending as a public member, and Pryor.
I wasn't here at that meeting, so can I approve the minutes?
I believe legally you actually are allowed,
You
and it is
can.
also a practice sometimes to abstain. It's at your discretion.
Okay, I approve, yes.
That's 5 yays, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions. So the motion carries.
Okay, so let me ask this. Is there any member, I'd like to move on to the one voting item that we have in light of some scheduling conflicts. So, and that is the approval or the discussion of the proposed RFP. Is there any member of the public who is here who wants to make a comment on that agenda item?
There are no members of the public present.
Okay, well then why don't we move on to that item, Chris?
Great. I'm going to take one moment just to start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, let's dive into it. So, good afternoon, committee members. Welcome back. I'd like to also just take a moment to note that we have 2 commissioners who are new to the committee, and those are Commissioners Morales and Pryor. And Maria was planning to join as a member of the public because she needed to change her location, but we do have, so she might be in the attendee pool at some point, but we do have Commissioner Pryor. Welcome. I have had onboarding calls with both of the 2 new committee members, so to kind of bring them up to speed, but I did incorporate a couple of slides into item 4.3 in the way of a refresher for everybody. I promise not to spend too long on the refresher piece. Before I present staff's proposal for a resolution vis-a-vis an RFP for 24-25 funds, I'm just going to say at the very start, and this is, I'm sure you saw it in the materials, today staff is recommending to the committee not that it adopt or recommend an RFP and then on March 29th it would not be staff's recommendation that the commission adopt an RFP, but rather that today the committee seek authority from the full commission at the end of this month to approve the RFP in April. And that would give us about 3 to 4 more weeks to just collect a little more information, which I will describe, to make a final staff recommendation for things like a funding formula. And then this committee would reconvene in April to make a decision. Okay, so that's just kind of like, that's the stakes for this piece. The ultimate resolution is essentially recommending seeking delegated authority. I'll keep the background kind of brief because I think this will come back very quickly to you or you remember it well. but especially for our new committee member, the CARE Act created a new court program where adults with severe mental health issues can access behavioral health care, stabilization medication, housing, and other community services. As I think everyone remembers, it launched in 2023 in 8 counties, and that includes Los Angeles County. It has to launch statewide by the end of this calendar year. The statutory context for the commission's work here is that CARE courts, and this is in the CARE Act, must appoint qualified legal services projects to represent respondents. And only if no QLSP has agreed to do so will the CARE court appoint a public defender office instead. The CARE Act also provides a role for the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission and funding QLSPs and support centers. The Budget Act of 2023 and this year, the Budget Act 2024, will provide the actual funding amount for that work. I'm going to actually just sort of skip over this slide and the next one. I'm just going to flag for you. I have a slide on here on who can be a CARE court respondent. And my next slide is on who can be a petitioner. If that feels relevant, I can tab back to this and show that to you. But I will just kind of say as a reminder, CARE court respondents are all adults. They have to be experiencing a severe mental health issue that is enumerated in the CARE Act. And it's generally schizophrenia. But I think that there's a more specific description in the CARE Act. And this is a simple process, and there's a long list of parties that can be petitioners. They include roommates, family members, first responders. I will just say about this slide that if any statutorily permissible petitioner files for a respondent, the court will eventually substitute that petitioner with the county behavioral health agency. Okay, so the Budget Act of 2024 has yet to pass. It is the act that will provide funding for various state programs, including CARE Court, beginning July 1 of 2024 through the end of next state fiscal year, which would be June 30th of 2025. So it would be providing the funds that the commission would administer after this state fiscal year, this June 30. And while the Budget Act may take until mid to late June to pass, which is not uncommon, staff at the State Bar do recommend that the commission and that this committee work to release an RFP in the spring. Normally, the commission would wait until the authorizing statute had passed to even release an RFP for a competitive grant and to release an application so that it's not releasing information prematurely. And you know, there's obviously a preference for releasing, for example, final funding figures. Because CARE Court has already launched in 8 counties and therefore will be up and running with the need to make appointments to QLSPs and or county public defender offices on July 1 in at least 8 counties, there is a need for at least those 8 counties to have some informational clarity about who will be representing respondents after June 30th. And so therefore, staff is recommending that the commission endeavor to release an RFP and field competitive applications subject to the forthcoming Budget Act. So it would be like a conditional RFP and with much expectation management and caveats for the readers and audience of that document, that everything will be subject to the passage of the Budget Act in June. But that will facilitate making awards as soon as possible after July 1, as opposed to, say, waiting for the act to pass and releasing an RFP in July and trying to make awards in August or September. To estimate the funding that would be available, staff recommends at this time, and this is in consultation with other agencies, that the RFP cite to the governor's January 2024 proposal of $51.7 million for QLSPs, support centers, and other entities to do this work in 24-25, next state fiscal year. Of course, we have to say, and I actually would encourage committee members to really, and anyone who's listening to really take this to heart, the Budget Act may provide less funding than that. It is indeed the case that data, as you will see in a moment on a slide, data is actively emerging about the participation in care court to date, like the number of petitions and appointments, and that is relevant to the funding needs for next state fiscal year. And the amount that the governor proposed as recently as January may change and it may go down. At this time, and we have asked, we do not have a more reliable funding figure that we can provide, but we are actively seeking reassurance as to what a realistic funding figure will be. And come mid-April, when this committee might reconvene to approve an RFP, we might have an updated funding figure at that time. But as of today, and as of this week, we've been told that this is an appropriate figure to use. Okay. I'm going to just kind of take a pause for just a quick second. I feel like I said a lot. Does anybody have questions about anything I just said? And if not, we can go back. I'll move along. Okay. So this is a little bit unusual, but we thought it might be worthwhile. Staff has posted for today's meeting and may post with the materials for the commission meeting on March 29th, what we called an example RFP. Commissioners might be more accustomed to seeing something that we would call like a draft RFP or even a proposed RFP. That's usually something we would post if asking the commissioner committee to actually approve it and adopt it as a policy document. So for example, in April, staff anticipates posting a recommended or a proposed RFP for you to actually vote on. So for today, we thought it would helpfully facilitate a meaningful policy discussion at this committee meeting, and perhaps also a delegation of authority on March 29th to post what we called an example RFP. We went with that characterization of this document because we're not asking you to vote on it today. Everything is sort of on the table. you know, the scoring rubric, the application topics, the reporting requirements, the funding, the estimates might change. So we truly are considering an example, but we really did want to get the conversation going with you. So the memo for today and the example RFP does propose a timeline for making awards by the commission's meeting in June. It starts with today's committee meeting to recommend delegating authority to approve the RFP. If the commission agrees, it would do that on March 29th. I actually could put the date in here now because we have confirmed a committee meeting for April 11th to approve an RFP. State Bar staff would have an application ready to release that day or the next day, provided the committee didn't have any dramatic changes to application questions, which would also be fine, but we would need to push back the application release. But if it's modest changes or looks good, we could even release the application same day or next day. So it could be like as early as April 12th. We anticipate, as I'll note on a future slide, releasing a similar looking application to last year, which was already somewhat streamlined compared to the commission's other competitive grant applications. And so last year it felt comfortable to give applicants about 3 to 3.5 weeks to complete it. I think this year, if we do release it around April 12th, we could probably give them 3 to 4 weeks, maybe the full month to complete it. That would leave this committee's scoring team about 2 to 3 weeks to score. And I'm just going to hazard a guess right now, and please don't put too much weight into this, but I do think it's relevant. You might appreciate the estimate. I think at this time, we're probably estimating a modest number of applications. I don't think you're going to see as many as you would for, say, like an HP competitive grant. This last year, we had 2. You might remember. I think it will be more than 2, but it may not be more than like a dozen. So it's not going to be, I think it will be a reasonable number to review in a 2 to 3 week period. And then this committee has a meeting scheduled for June 7th to recommend awards to the full commission when the full commission meets on June 21st. That's actually about when the Budget Act might pass, to be honest. It could be mid to late June. It could be like right before July. I actually would happily defer to Lauren Klein, our liaison from LAC, on like a realistic time frame for that, because I think they do a really good job tracking the passage of the Budget Act. But in my limited experience, it tends to be mid to late June. So we would essentially be doing a really quick turnaround for those counties that have launched Care Court already, and we'll want to know kind of as close to July 1 as possible who's going to be representing respondents or continuing to do that. We did consider earnestly consider for quite some time whether to bifurcate this application and maybe have a different timeline for the cohort 2 counties. because they may launch as late as December, although they too could volunteer to launch earlier. And in fact, 2 counties have expressed an interest in launching before December. Those are Kern and San Mateo. Last I heard is they might move up their start date to July 1, and I think our liaison from the Judicial Council might even know more about that. So we did consider that idea, but because their actual launch date is sort of at their discretion before December, and because we're not anticipating a significant increase in applications if we go the bifurcated route, for the sake of administrative efficiency in part, but mostly so that cohort 2 behavioral health agencies, county public defender offices, and others, superior courts, can have informational clarity as soon as possible as well. We recommended a unified application timeline for cohort 1 and 2. I'll pause again because I feel like I'm saying a lot, and if anyone has a question, you're welcome to interrupt me at any time. Okay. I am trying to get us to a vote for Catherine by 3, so I think we're doing well on time. But go ahead, Catherine.
I just was gonna say that this committee did amazing work last year, coming up with an application and working through a lot of the details. And I guess for that, and I understand we're not approving an application at this meeting, which is fine. But it would be helpful to me to know if there's changes that the staff is recommending on last year's application when we see it again, just as a way to make my review at least easier, because I do think we did a great job last year coming up with something that was workable.
Thank you. And at this time, and as always, staff is very very welcoming of the last year's scoring team members' input on how the application could be even better. So I don't think we feel wedded to the application. At this time, we're proposing to keep it the same, less what I would call technical updates. Like last year's application listed only 8 possible counties, so now it'd be 58. It would also specify if you pick this county, you better be ready by July 1, but this county it could be as late as December. Like those sort of technical updates. Unless the committee, and the committee's completely welcome to do this, of course, tinkers with the scoring rubric, or Vanetta, who was also, I'm so sorry, I think Commissioner Campbell participated in one of the scoring sessions, and then Chair Iskin substituted in for Commissioner Campbell for another session. So if you remember, you're you know what, it'd be really helpful to ask this next time, we can add that in. Okay. So with the example, I'm just going to say this one more time and then I'll stop saying it. Most of these slides are sort of citing to the example RFP, and so it's illustrative at this time. It would more or less be staff's recommendation if we were to bring a recommendation to you today, but that's not what's happening. So these slides are describing the example RFP. So eligibility, and it's modeled on last year's request for proposals. So eligibility for grant would be limited to QLSPs, support centers, and other qualifying entities. And as a reminder, the original RFP last year, the one that the committee passed in late June, was for just QLSPs and support centers, because those were the only entities the Budget Act of 2023 originally described as eligible for competitive funding. But then via Budget Act amendment, was SB Senate Bill 104, which passed last September, the eligibility for legal training and technical assistance funds, which was previously just for support centers, became open to other entities that have expertise in providing legal training and technical assistance to nonprofit QLSPs or public defender offices. And so that the support center funding became eligible to other entities, and we indeed had what we call an other entity applicant, which is the Office of the State Public Defender, apply for those funds, anticipating, but being unsure, but anticipating that the Budget Act of 2024 will leave that legal training and technical assistance pot of funding to do what we call the support center type work available to other entities as well. The RFP would acknowledge that and caveat it with this was something that happened sort of via an amendment last year. We're assuming it'll happen again, but we don't know for sure. For QLSPs, for QLSPs and support centers, they would need to be 2024 IULTA grantees. That's kind of standard. It's just, you're a current grantee at the time that you're applying. Your current qualified legal project or support center at the time that you're applying for a competitive grant. The example RFP leaves the language as is for this was from either the CARE Act or the Budget Act, but the quoted material. But it leaves that as is. So essentially for QLSPs, it would be to provide legal representation in care act proceedings and matters related to care agreements and plans. And you may recall that in June, the committee had a really good discussion, and LAC participated in this, about like how that can be interpreted via technical assistance for programs. What does it mean for something to be related to one of those three things? But the verbiage itself is just from the Budget Act and CARE Act. And then for support centers, the excerpted verbiage from the Act is training, support, and coordination. So we do not propose to change that because we anticipate the Budget Act will use similar language. But of course, how that's interpreted and what technical assistance staff provides is something we could revisit. So this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting, because of course the funding amount's going to be different, and we have 58 counties instead of just 8 counties. And Catherine, both you and Eric wrote in with some supplemental questions, and I think I was able to pull most of the data you both asked us that were relevant to this topic. I hope so anyway. So last spring, as part of the governor's proposal for the Budget Act of 2023, and then again in January 2024, the governor proposed about $51.7 million for state fiscal year 24-25 to support, and this, I just excerpted it so you could see how it was worded, public defender and legal services organizations that will provide legal counsel to care participants. Last year, that phrasing was inclusive of the work of support centers, other entities, and state bar and judicial counsel costs. So we're sort of assuming that that phrasing is going to be inclusive of those other things as well for 24-25. So it's not the whole 50, if we read it the same way it was read last year, the whole 51.7 isn't just for respondents counsel, most of it is. But if we kind of apply the same percentages of that pot that went to public defender offices and QLSPs last year, as opposed to support centers, other entities, and agency administrative costs, it was about 92% for respondents representation, 4% for legal training, technical assistance, and 4% for admin costs. And so if the number stays 51.7 million, that top line number, that comes out to be about 47,564,000 to represent respondents, a little over 2 million each for support centers, other entities, and then any administrative costs, including reporting. I just kind of included this bold caveat on every slide where I had it, because I just like, we're going to say it again and again, and we're going to put it in anything in writing that this is just an estimate at this time, and it's subject to the actual Budget Act of 2024. Catherine.
So what happens? So to your point of maybe the demand for the services is less than expected, which might influence next year's budget. What happens to the funds that were allocated this year if they're not spent for care court?
At this time, and we have checked in with the judicial council about this, but we are working with them to see if it might be possible to avoid an immediate return of those funds after June 30th. But at this time, it is our reading of the Budget Act, theirs and ours, that the funds would have to come back over the summer, whatever was left over as of June 30th, because the Budget Act of 24-25 would be providing the funding for services on July 1, or to continue services starting July 1. We realize that might cause a cash flow wrinkle. It may or may not pose a cash flow wrinkle for some offices that have then a gap in when they've had to return any unused funds via invoice to our office, and when 24-25 funds might arrive. So we're exploring if there might be a creative, budget, some creative budget flexibility that might mitigate that. But at this time, just to be conservative, that's what we're expecting to happen.
Yeah, thanks. Just
okay. And I think maybe okay. So this is where I'm gonna just I'm gonna acknowledge for Eric and Catherine that I have because you asked about this after we posted the materials. I have the 2-step formula from the memo on this slide, but then I have the next slide. Catherine has some data you asked about, and then Eric, I will actually switch to showing a spreadsheet that has data that you asked about. But I'm just going to start by describing how the formula looks different. That is in the example RFP and would be staff's recommendation as of today pending additional input from the Judicial Council and maybe others like the Department of Finance. But essentially just to say this is sort of the example RFPs approach. So step one is the same step that the staff recommended and that the committee and commission adopted for 23-24 funds on the advice of the Department of Finance, which was to begin by allocating the funds for Respondents Council. So we're not, put aside the funding for support centers and other entities. That would be to do statewide work, but for Respondents Council, which happens at the county level, the formula we used last year and we would keep this step for next year is to divide each county's population, is to essentially determine an initial allocation on the basis of each county's general population. So you simply divide each county's most recent general population data from the U.S. Census Bureau by the total population for all counties. It would be all 58 this time. And then that percentage is sort of their initial allocation percent. Step two, last year, was to then set and apply a minimum, like a funding floor of $60,000 so that all counties would receive at least $60,000. 2 of the 8 counties were raised up to $60,000 last year. And those were Tuolumne and Glenn. Glenn was kind of a big jump up, and Tuolumne was a small one. And the other 6 counties essentially chipped in some funds to raise them to $60,000. We did run the formula the same way for 24-25 to see how many counties were going to fall under 60,000 and need to be brought up. And so I actually have that on a spreadsheet because Eric asked me to prepare that, and I'll show that in a moment. What we saw right away and what we would sort of submit to for the committee's consideration is that applying this is going to sound a little bit like I've made up my mind. My mind just keeps going to one size fits all funding floor, but I think a more like neutral term would be a flat funding floor of $60,000 might be a bigger jump than is necessary for a very small county. And of course, just the smallest county that comes to mind is Alpine. But for some, maybe Alpine, maybe a couple of others, particularly small counties, it might be a really big jump and more than they need. So we explored other options that might still provide what we might call minimum funding, but leave it somewhat tied to the relative size of the county. And what our team came up with, and what we sort of pitched in the example RFP, we'd love your feedback on this. We can always go back to the drawing board and come back with a final recommendation in April, is essentially to give them their general allocation, the general population-based allocation, which for a county that's very small, like Alpine, might just be a couple $1,000s, and give them a flat bump. Instead of raising everyone up to 60,000, they essentially give them 10,000 more, 20,000 more, or 30,000 more. To avoid a totally arbitrary number as a bump, what we did is we looked at the most. In the example RFP, we proposed something like $20,000 bump up to the $60,000. And that number is tied, and the next slide will make this a little bit more clear because when I say it out loud, it's a little weird. It's the most that any county this year received per estimated case for 2 cases. And in a moment, you'll see what I mean. But Glenn County received the most of any of the 8 counties per estimated case, and that was $10,000 per estimated respondent. So that's essentially the most that any of the counties that were under the floor last year got, and it was for 2 cases. So $10,000 per case for 2 cases was $20,000. That was sort of our attempt to make it so it wasn't a random number. Just for comparison purposes, if you look at the average that each of the 8 counties got per estimated case, the average was $5,811 per respondent. So Glenn actually got almost twice what the 8 county average was. I'm going to go to the next slide, and Catherine, this has some data you asked me to pull, but it also makes the Glenn, most that any county got per estimate case a little more clear. So what this is showing you is for 23-24, the current state fiscal year, the 8 counties, it's showing you what their initial allocation was, and that's column 2 here. I will flag they actually ended up getting a little more than this because there was some funding left over from the amount for support centers and other entities that the statute required us to allocate back out for respondent representation. So this was like the initial RFP amount. What column 3 does is it takes the estimated number of cases and this was a case estimates that we got from other agencies that are administering care court. This wasn't like the state bar did research or something to come up with these numbers. These were provided to us. But what we did is we divided the allocation by the estimated number of cases. So you can see in Glenn, they were raised up to the funding floor of 60,000. The case estimate for them was 6 for this fiscal year. That led to a sort of per estimated respondent rate, so to speak, of $10,000. And you can see the other counties were less per estimated respondent. And Tuolumne was the other one at the bottom row that also was raised up to 60,000. The last column is to show you how many cases they each reported in October through December. And they have yet to report on January through March. Unfortunately, we're just a couple weeks shy of getting that data. But that's just to show you in the first quarter how many cases they had. So Glenn, and this is not necessarily a surprise, had 0 in the first quarter. I think they have since had at least 1 case. LA was at 27. I asterisked that because LA was the only county of the 8 that actually only reported on 1 month. It launched in December. And then you can see sort of where everyone else is at. And I think the story of these numbers is the initial estimates for cases in the first year of care court for these 8 counties were somewhat high. Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah, Catherine has a
Oh,
comment.
Catherine, you might be on mute.
Sorry, so I think as we wrestle with this in April, like you'll have the data through March.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth extrapolating from that to see what the average case amount is, because that tells you something, right? Like what actually happened, not just based on the estimates. So like my quick math, I mistakenly assumed LA County had 27 for that quarter, not that, but when you do the math and you annualize that, that would be 81 cases, right? 27 times 3 more quarters. And that would result in $125,000 per case if they only did 81 cases in a year, right? And no matter what, that's, I mean, like even if Glenn only does 2, LA County is still going to have a lot more money left than Glenn. So to me, like the estimates were based on kind of a formula of what people thought they were going to be doing. But I think the actual data will also help us look at, you know, our county's doing some minimum threshold and we should adjust up or down for that. So if we can do that kind of projection out of what it looks like for the first year, and maybe pay some attention, you know, more attention to what's happening in the second quarter, potentially maybe give us the data for both of those quarters, because one might expect an uptick in the second quarter. That would be the trend for the year, not just what the average is of the first 2 quarters.
I do.
Does that make sense?
News.
Yeah.
It does, yeah. Good news and bad news, I think, for the timing. So the bad news, I'll start the bad news. So I think you will get data that's along the lines of what you're hoping for in April. The bad news is that the public defender offices in 2 QLSPs representing respondents will likely have until April 15th to submit their data. So unless they
Will
submit it a
likely
little
what?
early, they'll
Chris?
likely have until April 15th to submit their data. And the committee will be meeting on April 11th. However, the good news, the hopeful good news is that we have asked other agencies for revised estimates, so implementing agency estimates at the state level for 24-25 that we can break down by county. And we were unsure if something like that might be available in time, but we were pleased to hear that an implementing agency thinks they might be able to share county level estimates for petitions and cases for 24-25 that will be more conservative than what were the agency estimates for 23-24. So that may be even a little bit better than trying to extrapolate from 2 quarters of data. But yeah, we may not have like the data for each county at that moment.
I just wonder if it's I mean, there's only 8 of them. Is it just possible to call them and say, your report is due 4 days later? Can you tell us?
Can you just tell us?
Tell us
Yeah,
what
because they will have.
is. I mean, I wouldn't say
Yes.
that if it was 58 counties, but I do think it's helpful because there's the number of petitions filed, but there's the number that actually become cases. I mean, it's just there's distinctions with the numbers, and I think the more data that we have, the better better we will be able to kind of figure out some funding formula that makes sense.
I think that's a reasonable, I think that's a very reasonable request of them. And I'm gonna ask my colleague Helen, who's kindly taking the minutes for today, to help me remember that. I think that we can ask for that in time to try and have that by April 11th. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. So let me actually stop sharing my screen for just a moment because I'm going to switch to a spreadsheet that Eric asked me to pull that would show, and I am tracking the time. I think we can get to a vote by 3. But Eric, I might not be able to leave this on for a super long time. But that kind of shows what the difference would be if we actually left it as a flat $60,000 funding floor for next year at the county level. So one moment. And to make this spreadsheet a little bit, this is literally an allocation spreadsheet we use. So to make this a little easier, I'm going to hide a couple of columns that I don't think we need to look at. Okay, so you can see up here, this with this spreadsheet's automatically doing is essentially it's taking the top line number that was proposed in January. It's calculating the amount that would be for respondents council. It's setting a adjustment threshold of $60,000 or less, and then giving an adjustment amount of up to $20,000. So I know there's a lot of rows here, but if you permit me, I'm just going to kind of suggest what you pay attention to. So you can almost kind of ignore columns B and C. That's actually just showing their most recent general population data and what the allocation percent would be on the basis of that alone. Column H, the blue one, is showing you what their amount would be if we did the new approach that the example RFP describes, where if they were going to get less than $60,000, they get a bump of $20,000 up to $60,000. Column, and so this would be the amount that it was in the posted materials, is the blue column. Column J shows what it would be if we actually followed last year's approach of giving everyone who was under $60,000 exactly $60,000, just sort of a one-size-fits-all minimum funding floor. Column K is the column you might want to, I'll zoom in a little bit more for you, you might want to pay the most attention to. It's the difference. So if it's a green, it's a positive difference, which means that this year's approach actually gives them that county a little bit more. And just to make it, and then red means that they would be getting a little less than if we followed last year's approach. So for example, as you can imagine, a one-size-fits-all funding floor of $60,000 gives a little bit more to those small counties than would just giving some of them a $20,000 bump. So that's why under the new approach, Alameda County is coming out $10,000 ahead. The bigger counties are kind of giving over a little less under the new approach. But the idea is like a county like Alpine, which would get 21,865 under the new approach, which might be a more, or if you wanted to make it a $30,000 adjustment, it'd be 31,865. But that might be a more like feel right size than giving them the flat rate of 60,000. But that's why it shows a negative number.
Wait, Chris, so column H is staff's current proposal,
That's right.
and column K or column J is using last year's flat funding approach
That's
of
right.
60,000.
Yeah, and you'll see there's like more 60s in here, so that's to be expected. Column K is just showing you the difference. This is obviously not something I would expect the committee to look at this on the screen and be like, I've absorbed all this at the county level. I just want you to know that this sort of analysis exists, and if it's helpful, we could even post something like this in the materials for like April, and you could like read it.
Yeah,
have a couple days to look at it.
I think that's great if you can do that. I mean, I guess my observation is that for the counties that are gaining, they're actually not really gaining very much money because there's now 58 of them. And so that's why I guess I believe like that of those other data points about what's actually happening in the counties become just important so that we can make sure that all counties, the small counties and the big ones have sufficient resources to do the work that they're being asked to do under this. So to me, it's all kind of connected, but the data is super interesting. So
no, I think that's right. Like if you look at Alpine, for example, like if you go scroll up, Chris, to the top, like so under this year's approach, they would get 22,000. Under last year's approach, they would get 60. I mean, without the data that Catherine's talking about, I mean, I have no idea if the 22,000 is enough or the 60,000 is too much.
And LA only gains like 61,000.
I was just
so,
gonna point out,
like, it
'cause
doesn't
to
really,
Catherine's
like, I don't
point,
know, it's, anyway.
yeah,
But
that was, I was just gonna say, Gavin, to your point, I was like, the county that you would expect to benefit the most from the new approach would be LA. And you can see that it comes out with 61,000 more dollars,
Yeah.
which isn't, I think, a lot when you compare that their allocation either way is over $11 million.
yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, super interesting. Thanks for doing that. It was a great question, Eric, too, to ask for that.
And Helen, maybe you can help me remember that for April's meeting, unless staff's recommendation changes and we go back to like just the old approach or something like that, but we still think that it's worth looking at more than one model, we can post with the materials like a county breakdown that shows the difference.
And is it possible for us just to get a copy of the slides that you're showing and maybe that data chart, just so we have it for next time? Maybe just send it to us like after this meeting or something. That'd be great.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I was just keep saying, Helen, thank you for remembering all of these things. Thank
You
you.
got
You're
it.
taking the
She's
notes.
giving you the
Yeah.
thumbs up all the time. She's got you.
Exactly. Okay, great. So I think we're getting close to the 3. So I think we're going to get to the resolution in a few slides. Let me go back to sharing those. One moment to start.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say while you're looking for that, the resolution is pretty simple. We're simply asking for a delegation of authority. We can continue past 3 o'clock to talk about
Yeah, absolutely.
aspects of the RFP, and we should do that.
Wonderful. So I'll go back one slide. So okay, so this slide is just showing the breakdown that by these 2 slides, this one and the following slide, are showing the breakdown by county under the new proposed approach in the example RFP that would do away with the one-size-fits-all funding floor of 60,000, which is completely on the table. To reconsider that. And this is the same numbers that was in the initial column that I was showing in the spreadsheet just a moment ago, and it's in the materials. I'm going to move us along, but I can tab back to this slide if that's
Okay, and just my other request is like, if because this number might change and go down, it seems like, because the money isn't all being spent, like these are based on an assumption of a much significant amount of money, 54 million. And if that number is going to be different, let's say 30 million or what, I'm completely making up a number. It's actually really important to look at the chart with the new numbers because it will have some impacts, I think, on how the proportions will be the same, but the dollar amounts will be less. So I feel like to make those calls about the funding formula, we actually have to have a better sense of what the number, the total amount being distributed is.
Yeah, I agree. And we did receive the advice from another implementing agency that come mid-April, if when the commission releases an RFP, if the administration has yet to update publicly its proposed funding, which there's a very good chance it will wait till the May revise to do that.
Right.
That what might be prudent is in the RFP and any announcement language, like in an email, to say something like it very bold, like very high in a high profile fashion, say the $51.7 million was based in part on an estimated number of cases that would be for next year, but it would be based in part on an estimated number of cases for this year. That's in the thousands, like 4,000 range. The actual number of cases to date has been X, and essentially just allow the reader sort of to see that it is quite a bit less, and then to just sort of say it's very possible that the funding proposal for next year will be adjusted to reflect the
Yeah,
true number
I
of
think
cases.
that's all fine, but for me to agree to what the funding formula would be, I think fine, I accept you won't know the number because I think that's true, but then maybe it's looking at it in a series of $10 million reductions to see what the implications are, so that if we're being asked to approve a formula that's based on a much higher number, that we actually understand what the implications are for individual counties if that number is instead 41 or 31 or 21, whatever. I mean, you know, just to be able to have that full picture.
Great. That's great. Yeah, I agree. And the other caveat I want to say before I kind of move on to the other pieces that aren't really related to funding, but more like scoring, is the State Board has begun conversations with the relevant partners just to make sure that their input is incorporated in a way that we can share that with the committee come mid-April. So we are touching base with the Judicial Council, the California Health and Human Services Agency, and the Department of Finance in particular. Initial sort of reactions have been that of support for exploring these different options, but there are kind of some open questions that we hope to have answered for you by April, such as, would it be necessary to prorate allocations for 24-25 to estimated launch date for that county's care court? I don't want to jump the gun and share a premature staff recommendation, but there are some reasons to do it and there's some reasons to not do it, including that it would take quite a bit of funding from 50 counties and give it to 8 counties, when those 50 counties could choose to move up their launch date almost at any time. And like I mentioned earlier, like Kern and San Mateo have already said that they might actually go in July, and that other counties could join them in doing that. So it is not necessarily staff's recommendation at the time that we prorate, but it might be the Department of Finance's or Judicial Council of California's strong recommendation that we do. So by mid-April, by the time we post those materials, we will have consulted everyone and be able to tell you. Okay. We recommend keeping the scoring rubric the same. And so the example RFP keeps it more or less verbatim the same. The only thing, slight edit I made was the category heading used to say like project evaluation just says evaluation, and project impact and strategies just says impact. And that's to align the vocabulary with the commission's new rule around discretionary grant making and the use of a scoring rubric. It just uses the same language now that's in the rule. But substantively, the scoring rubric is the same. We think staff thinks it worked well last year. Of course, would value Commissioners Lakemore, Iskins, and Campbell's input on if they would recommend a change, but we didn't see the need for one.
Chris, can we take a look at the resolution?
Yes. So advancing to staff's proposed resolution, I'll just read it out loud because it's so short. Should the committee concur with staff's proposal, passage of the following resolution is recommended. Resolved that the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Care Court Grants Committee recommends that the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission delegate to the committee authority to approve a request for proposals, including award timeline, application topic, scoring rubric, and reporting requirements for 2024-2025 Care Court grants, and to recommend awards to the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission.
So this is a pretty broad grant. I mean, we don't even necessarily under this resolution have to act in April. I mean, I understand that we probably want to, but if for some reason we needed more time or we wanted to do something a little different, the way I read this, we would have authority to do that.
Yes, that's correct. The application timeline, including the release of the RFP, like the release date, would be at the committee's discretion.
So Catherine will move the motion, the resolution.
I'll second. Is there any discussion? Anybody want to make a comment?
And then I'll just observe that well, yeah, we are at 2:56, so a vote might be imminent. We paused on public comment.
No, I asked for public comment on this agenda item and nobody had any.
Yeah. Perfect.
So I think we can move to a vote.
So thank you. So I have Commissioner Blakemore moving, Chair Iskin seconding, and I'll take the vote. And I apologize, I should actually take the chair's vote last. So Eric, I'll call you last. So Commissioner Blakemore,
Yes.
Campbell,
Yes.
Escobedo,
Yes.
and I am required to read aloud the names of those who are not present. So Morales is absent. Judge Klein is absent. Commissioner Pryor
Yes.
and Chair Iskin.
Yes.
That's 5 yeas, 0 nays, 0 abstentions. So this motion carries.
And Eric, thank you for accommodating my schedule. I appreciate it.
Sure.
And I'm going to disconnect. I will see you all in April.
Enjoy your
Thank
grandchild.
you,
Bye,
Catherine. It was
everyone.
nice to see
Thank
you.
you. Thanks.
Do you want to double back and maybe if cover some of the pages if you want to that you've
Yeah,
you've
and this will be
rushed
pretty
through?
quick. And this is the I think this is probably the less controversial policy questions then is the how the funding is allocated by county. So staff's recommendation is to keep the scoring rubric the same. Mostly for commissioner, everyone's refreshed recollections, but commissioners Pryor and Morales to be able to see it. We did not tinker with it in any way, but this is what was posted with the materials. The application topics are generally tied to the scoring rubric. So we didn't change the rubric, so we didn't really change the application topics either. But just for everyone's recollection, it includes a project profile. This is pretty standard for commission's competitive grants, which sort of establishes their funding request, counties of focus, an abstract. Detail about their eligibility to do the work, their qualifications to do the work, other information that the scoring team can use to score them using the rubric, detailed project budgets. For this grant, it would be at the county level because each county would be getting an allocation that they could request up to that amount to serve that county. And the expectation would be if they were to ask for a county's entire allocation to serve respondents, that they would be agreeing to accept all of those cases. In this year, the two QLSPs that both applied to serve San Francisco, and they both together sought less than San Francisco's entire allocation. In fact, it ended up being about a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split between them and the county public defender's office. So they did not apply to serve all of San Francisco's respondents. They have to date, however, I think, been able to take all of those appointments so far. And then a project assurances document. At this time, staff recommends keeping the reporting categories the same. We just, to save a little bit of space in the memo, we just cited to the RFP, which is verbatim the requirements that the committee adopted last August for reporting. I'll just remind everyone that those were based on the commission's reporting framework for the Equal Access Fund program, and that was something the Budget Act 2023 actually prescribed, that the commission do that to try and keep the data consistent and comparable across grants as much as possible. So we anticipate the Budget 2024 might use similar language, so we would keep it the same. And that took us to the resolution. So we do have two other agenda items, which are staff updates, but I will pause and see if there are any other questions or thoughts for staff to put in their notes on the RFP.
I mean, I just observed that, given the lack of certainty about how much money is going to be available and just how many cases have been experienced in the various counties, that I mean, ideally it would be a lot better to do this later in the year, and I do appreciate that there are counties that are currently engaged in this process and need to have maybe some certainty starting July 1. But I'm just wondering out loud if there is some way that we could provisionally provide some money to the 8 counties that are actually engaged in the program, while at the same time kind of waiting until later in the year when we actually know a little more about how this program is, what's happening with this program.
I speak as a member of the staff team. I share your desire for informational certainty, like where we can get it. And obviously other commissioners should feel free to react to that. But yeah, staff's proposal is to just do it all by July 1, because it would also be like one pot of funding for the state in the Budget Act of 2024. So we would be essentially, no matter what, we would be setting aside some amount of that for the 8 counties that would need to kind of know who's representing respondents come July 1. And then whatever we had set aside would then be in play for cohort 2. One thing we as State Bar staff members looked into is, might the commission receive more applications if we did a 2-tranche process? And we looked at that for a couple of months and had what I would describe as informal conversations with programs. We did one kind of formal looking survey in December, but that felt a little early. The informal conversations in January and February, and it was staff sort of collective anecdotal sense that it wouldn't be a lot more applications if we were to, like, say, give cohort 2 programs 2 more months.
So for 23, 24, we approved, I believe, 2 QLSPs, both of them in San Francisco, right? And then for the remaining, do I have that right? And then for the remaining counties, nobody applied, no QLSPs applied, so all of the money is going to the public defender's offices.
Yes.
So this year, let's say we have more agencies applying in San Francisco. I don't know if we will. Does the whole thing start over again? In other words, is it a whole new RFP where we could decide to stop funding the 2 that are being funded in San Francisco and award money to new people, theoretically at least?
Theoretically.
But that's highly unlikely, I guess, is what you're thinking. Because we're not.
They would, the 2 QLSPs that are San Francisco would need to reapply, and I believe they are very interested in reapplying. They have asked when this RFP will be released, but their eligibility to do the work would be, the committee would be able to reassess that.
So I don't know if Lauren is still on, but it looks like you are. What do you know about how many people who are realistically gonna, how many agencies we're realistically gonna see play in this sandbox?
I'm still here, and I think that Chris is right in his estimate that the amount is probably going to be low. I wouldn't estimate a bunch more cohort 1 organizations applying. I think that probably we'll stick with the same that we have, and I don't anticipate that a lot of cohort 2 organizations will apply either, for the same reasons that there was low applications last year.
Interesting. Any other commissioners have comments on this?
No, I mean, I'm curious to learn after April, kind of just hear the report back. I'm curious what public defenders were doing and what that looks like beyond the QLSPs. And the only curiosity I had is, after this year, do we know of any efforts around the policy? I think the last time around, we spent a little bit of time talking about what seemed to be, at least in my layman's opinion, a very restricted use of the funds. And there was a lot of debate about what goes on around it. And I don't know, this is just more for informational purposes, whether we're aware of any advocacy or policy efforts, or whether the legislature or anyone is contemplating kind of relooking at how narrow and restricted the use is, based on what they're learning or not.
I can say that I haven't heard any indication from anyone that they're thinking about loosening that, though. We will continue to tell folks at the legislature that that would be a good idea, that a lot more people could get helped if there wasn't such a restriction on the funding.
When you say restriction, what do you mean? That schizophrenia, you mean that it should be broader than that, or
the scope of what services can be provided? So many more legal aid organizations, I think, would participate in this program if, rather than representing folks at their care court proceeding, they were just providing ancillary services and a broad scope of ancillary services that might support a person in their care.
That's what I learned last go around, is for instance, like time spent around case management and things like that. They can't use these funds for that.
The Budget Act of 2023 used the same phrasing, likely to just avoid accidentally, like, describing something different, but it was the same phrasing that the CARE Act used. And so, is representation in CARE Act proceedings or matters related to care agreements or plans And that phrasing seems to, as a matter of conservative interpretation, suggest that it's like it has to be representation for their matter that's like currently in care court. And if they had an auxiliary matter that maybe was very related to that, like helping them solve maybe a housing issue from a different direction or something, would really truly improve their situation in care court, that even that might not actually be in bounds because of the way it was phrased.
So I have a question in terms of our, and in terms of our purview, right? And kind of the scope of the committee's role in all this is, would we, I take it that part of the data we're waiting on is in a sense an evaluate, kind of like a report back from the jurisdictions and other recipients of the funding. But I'm curious if when we get that back, would it be appropriate and within our purview to maybe see if in our agenda, when we're considering having a discussion in the committee, we might invite some grantees to learn and ask questions about the implementation was good. It seems like if it was a reasonable request and this was an appropriate forum, it might be helpful, because I'm not sure that that kind of conversation around implementation would be happening anywhere else that could help inform
It's
us as a commission and
totally,
the legislature.
totally appropriate for the commission and its committees to invite current grantees to make not even just public comments. They can be like guest presenters
I'm
at
thinking,
committee
yeah, like
meetings. Yeah.
presentations and ask
We
some
can
questions about,
agendize, you know.
yeah.
Yes, that's definitely.
So are you thinking, Efren, about that for the meeting when we would be considering the RFP in April?
Yeah, as we're releasing the RFP and as we've gotten, I'm thinking, Eric, I defer to you on the timing, but the thing I put for you and the rest of us to consider would be some timing in between when we got their data and we're releasing the RFP, inviting it still before the budget act is closed, right? The budget process is closed. Just inviting some presentations so we could hear a little bit about the last cycle implementation challenges and things like that.
Well, would you want to do that? I think it's a great idea. Would you want to do that before we approve the RFP in April? Because that would involve scheduling another meeting. Because I think that would take some time.
Yeah, I would defer to the more of the collective wisdom. I just think wherever it would fit, it would make sense. I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming, Chris, that it's good to learn. I don't know that we would have an impact and all of a sudden change the use restrictions, but it seems like a timing that it could. Yeah.
My only thoughts on it, I mean, I think this was a very cool idea. So that my initial thoughts are just that it's totally appropriate for the commission to invite a funding recipient. It could also be a public defender office to appear as a guest speaker and do have a conversation with the committee. It wouldn't be a public comment. It would actually be agendized. You could ask them questions about how it's going. The one thing I will flag is the two QLSPs who you would likely invite to give that will likely also be applicants. And so it may and what could be a competitive process where other QLSPs decide to throw their hat in this time. So that we'd want to be careful about how we sort of give them a microphone to the committee that's scoring everyone's proposals, and they were invited as guest speakers, but they also happen to be the only QLSPs that are doing this work. So if you feel like the information they can share is really important, that's not necessarily not allowed, but just to flag that be on the eve of a competitive process. And then you could also invite public defender offices. They would be invited as guest speakers. Staff could work with them to sort of let them know what the committee might be most interested in hearing about. I might recommend that the line of inquiry proceed is less in this spirit of we'll query whether or not it would be in the spirit of trying to advocate for a change in the Budget Act of 2024 phrasing wise, which actually is something that like LAC is like probably in a really great position to do, is say like, hey, this was the way it was worded last time. What about this, wording it this way? It could be, that could be the spirit of it, or it could be more just to help the committee make informed decisions about its grant making, or just understand how care court is rolling out on the ground, or like what the future is of QLSP's role vis-a-vis public, you know, that's it's kind of like we'd want to think through with you maybe what the goal is, and that's something staff could work with the chair to figure out. I would recommend trying to do it at the April meeting rather than trying to squeeze in another meeting, but that's just my
Well,
my
okay,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, but then if we're gonna do that, we want to script this and figure out with some precision what we want the presentations to cover. And I think we need a longer meeting.
Then an
I
hour
think,
and a half, yeah. And I
yeah,
do think you
sure.
would want to be careful about if those one or both of those QLSPs were planning to reapply in a competitive
Yeah.
process, maybe
Yeah, and I
not
think
letting them just talk about like look at how amazing we are, you know, that kind of thing, and
Right.
make it look like they got like a special opportunity to influence the committee's scoring decisions that others didn't get or something like that. We'd
Well,
want to be very careful
it doesn't
about
sound like the competition is going to be all that intense, really. So I'm not sure that's a problem.
to be realistic.
Yeah,
maybe not.
I want to, for the record, clarify. I think, you know, in the interest of engaging grantees would be really a line of questioning around a framing with respect to their past grant. So it's not about what are you doing moving forward and how are you doing really good, but more about we want to learn about how the funds helped in what areas, where did they maybe did not help, you know, what we're going to go into another round, something, but I just want to clarify my thought was that we would hear about their experience in implementing their past grant. So it wouldn't be about their future. Yeah.
Would it be possible, I guess what I would suggest, like, I think it's a good idea. Chris, I'm thinking we should have at least if we're going to do that, that the meeting be at least 3 hours. And that maybe anyone who's interested in participating in the inquiry or has ideas about what the subject or scope should be, maybe to submit ideas to staff. And then we can, so to help us formulate how we want to do this.
Yeah, and then maybe that, Eric, I think that's a good idea, because then maybe that could help figure out how much time we need. I think whatever time's needed would be ideal, but the staff might say, oh, you don't need 3, we could do it in 2 if we added just that half hour for the presentation and discussion. You know, I'm
I mean,
thinking.
I thought we were going to get through this agenda item in 20 minutes.
Well, you know, it's curious revisiting, and as I read the materials and prepared, I was really more thinking about, I'm curious about how that first year went. There's so much questions and opinions about the impact this funding could have as it's shaped. And so I think if we could do it, but yeah, I'm open. I think it's worth spending the additional time for us to really learn about this first rollout and implementation of it.
All right, 2.5 hours.
Deal. I'm happy to send you my thoughts, and I appreciate that invitation, and just send you thoughts on what we might want to hear, or what's at least questions on our mind.
Yeah, others too. And Lauren, I don't know whether you really care about how we do this, but if you guys think that there's a way that we should conduct an inquiry or questions that we should ask, you know, please I mean, I'm sure you feel free anyway, but please feel free to share your thoughts with Chris or with me.
Will do.
All right. Chris,
Chris,
do you
you're on
want to?
mute.
Yeah, you're on mute,
Oh,
Chris.
thank you. I was gonna say, Shannon, would you mind extending the committee's April 11th meeting to be 2.5 hours, which would be adding an hour? Let's keep it at the start time the same, but we may need to see if like we need to pick a different time that day or something, depending on
Schedules,
people's
yeah.
availability. But for right now, it's the easiest approach. If you have ideas for what would be helpful to hear, and I sort of like just made a note that the crux of it might be on your experience of this year, providing these services. But if you have other ideas about what might be helpful, if you would send them to staff, we want to avoid an accidental Bagley-Keene issue with an email chain among multiple commissioners. If you send it to staff can start to collect those, and we can present what everyone's input is to the chair and say, Eric, here's what everyone wrote in, what they might like to hear about. and then work with the chair to invite them and sort of frame what the conversation will be about for them.
So, but
Um,
so while we have a minute here, who should we invite? I mean, just thoughts off the top of your head. What do you think? Anybody? I mean, staff or Lauren or anybody. I mean, if we're going to do this, who should come?
There's two QLSPs that are representing respondents this state fiscal year. Legal assistance to the Elderly and Justice and Diversity Center of the Bar Association of San Francisco.
Okay.
All counties have a public defender office that received funding to represent the respondents. As of January, I think the San Francisco County Public Defender Office had yet to receive a case because the two QLSPs were accepting all the appointments, and the court is required to appoint a QLSP if one is available. So that's happening the way it's supposed to under the statute. But all the other counties had at least one case. I think even Glenn after December got its first case. So any of the county public defender offices could talk about how it's going. And then we have another funding recipient, which is the Office of the State Public Defender, but they're providing legal training and technical assistance. So it's a little different.
I'd recommend inviting Orange County Public Defender. They seem to be working very well with local legal aid organizations just to have legal aid provide input and things about available services, stuff like that. So they seem to be kind of exemplary in how they're handling this. So that's one that I would recommend. I've also heard that San Diego's had a somewhat higher volume of respondents than some other counties. Most counties have been pretty low. So perhaps San Diego could be another good one to invite.
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
saw the chart that they had a fairly high number of cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if the mix could be, so one is, one or two large counties, one large county that's getting a lot, one large county that's getting none. Not San Diego, because we know why San Diego's not getting some. And then, might be good to maybe do a smaller county and just hear that smaller county perspective too.
Okay.
So if you have more thoughts on this, please email them to me or any member of the staff team, and we'll collect them, and then we will confer with Eric on whom to invite and how to sort of prepare them.
Okay.
We do have two other, Eric, just to flag agenda items. They're on the faster side, and they are in the way of staff reports. And this is actually kind of a good segue because one of them is on the data that these funding recipients have provided for October through December, including, well, I show you the case numbers today, but Helen has like data on the client demographics and everything. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Helen. Helen, I realize I didn't introduce you to the committee at the start. So I'm so pleased to introduce to you Helen. He's actually been in our office for quite a while now. Helen started in the fall. There's been a key member of our Care Court Grants team, but the committee has not met since late September. So you didn't get to meet Helen, but she's been like working on Care Court as like almost full time since mid-October, and she's a senior program analyst, and I'm pleased to have her actually provide the staff report for the other two items on the agenda.
Oh, welcome.
Helen, you want to share your screen, right? You don't want me to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks, Chris, for that introduction. I will share my screen. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So thank you all for the discussion. Good afternoon, commissioners and committee members. As Chris mentioned, my name is Helen Yu. I'm a new senior program analyst in our office and a member of the Care Court team. So I'll be moving on to agenda item 4.1, update on the 2023-2024 Care Court funds. So I'll begin sharing with giving a brief background about Cohort 1 and Los Angeles County to provide context for the agenda item, and then I will share data from the first Care Court quarterly report. So I'll move on to the background. As a reminder, the 2023-2024 funding period is from October 1st, 2023 to June 30th, 2024. All recipients of our Care Court funds must report quarterly on expenditures and services. The following data that you will see in the upcoming slides reflects the reporting period from October 1st to December 31st, 2023. For the first quarterly report only, recipients of Care Court funds could include expenditures retroactive to August 1st, 2023. Qualified legal services projects and public defender offices report on new, ongoing, and closed representation of clients, including client demographics, petitioner status, legal outcomes, legal resolutions, economic benefits, and workload. And support centers and other entities report on trainings, convenings, research, and other support for QLSPs, public defender offices, courts, county behavioral health agencies, and others. So this slide shows the 2023-2024 recipients of Care Court funds. You'll see that number 2, Justice and Diversity Center of the Bar Association of San Francisco, which I'll be referring to as JDC, and number 3, Legal Assistance to the Elderly, which I'll be referring to as LAE. On the list there are 2 QLSP grantees. Both provide legal representation to respondents in San Francisco County. Number 5, Office of the State Public Defender is our other entity grantee, providing training and technical assistance to QLSPs and public defender offices. So I'll go ahead and jump into the data from the first quarterly report. But as I mentioned before, the reporting period was October 1st to December 31st, 2023. And I will caveat, as Chris mentioned earlier, that the LA County reporting data is for the month of December only. Here, figure 1 shows the number of cases reported by each county for cohort 1. Of the total number of cases, the bars on the graph display the number of open cases, that's in the dark blue, which is the number of cases QLSPs and public defenders are providing legal representation. The closed cases, which indicate there was a legal resolution and no representation was provided, are displayed in the shaded regions on the bar graph. We'll be sharing the legal resolutions for the closed cases in a later slide. On the graph, you'll see that San Diego County reported the highest number of cases for the first quarter. And I'd like to note that the number of cases reported for San Francisco County includes both JDC and LAE's reporting data. The San Francisco Public Defender's Office reported 0 cases for the first quarter, as the petitions were assigned to both of the QLSPs.
Helen, may I interject and
Sure.
just flag? These are the numbers of appointments that the funding recipients have reported to us as distinct from the number of petitions that were filed. So I've heard many more petitions did not make their way to becoming appointments for the public defender office or QLSPs, but they were maybe dismissed at the prima facie determination stage of Care Court because the plaintiff, they didn't establish a prima facie case that the plaintiff qualified. I'm sorry, not the plaintiff, the respondent qualified. So these actually became appointments.
Thanks, Chris. On this slide, table 1 shows the petitioner type by county. The majority of Care Court petitions have been filed by family members. San Diego County and Riverside County reported the most petitions filed by family members. The second most common petitioner type was first responders, also reported most by San Diego County. I do want to note that San Francisco County is split into 2 rows, displaying JDC and LAE's petitioner type reporting separately. No petitioner type filings were reported for Adult Protective Services Agency, Public Charity, Tribal Court, and a Tribal Health Agency. This slide shows the age and identity of respondents. Figure 2 shows the age of respondents from cohort 1 counties. 68%, or 104 cases total, 104 cases of the total 154 cases were reported as adult respondents, and 32% were reported as senior respondents, which equates to a total of 50 cases. Figure 3 shows the gender identity of respondents. 63% or 97 of the reported cases, respondents identified as male, where 36% or 56 of the reported cases, respondents identified as female, and one reported case identified a respondent as an unknown gender identity. Figure 4 shows the race and ethnicity of respondents. The largest number of cases, 35% of the reported cases, respondents identified their race and ethnicity as white, not Hispanic origin, followed by 26% where a respondent's race and ethnicity was reported as unknown. The smallest race and ethnicity categories were Asian or Pacific Islander and other race/ethnicity, each reported as 3% of the total cases.
And I'll interject again real quick just to say that the CARE Act provides that the Department of Healthcare Services will also collect respondent demographic data via county behavioral health agencies. And that data will become part of this very big high profile report that DHCS files with the legislature on a timeline that the CARE Act provides. The commission is also collecting respondent demographic data from a different direction via their council. And that's because the Budget Act of 2023, I'm sort of saying this for the record, requires the commission to collect data that's consistent and comparable with what it collects for other grants. And that includes things like race and ethnicity, gender identity. The commission's categories, which are consistent and comparable for this grant as for its other ones, are not necessarily the same races and ethnicities that DHCS is collecting. They use different phrasing, different groupings. I'm just saying for the record, these percentages might not perfectly align with categories that DHCS is using, and that's purposeful and statutorily permissible, if not required.
There's not alignment that I can see between this picture and the numbers below the picture. Like, what does the 17% correspond to? And what does the 12% correspond to?
The 17% corresponds to the race and ethnicity category. So that one would be Hispanic/Latino, and the parentheses right after it, the 26. 26 is the number of cases.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So like
it's a little hard to tell because the colors are also similar, but you can kind of, if you look at the key, you can kind of be like, oh, that shade of blue is slightly similar to that.
Slightly
box.
darker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah.
So
Sorry,
I think
back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Chris. So I think another way to read this can be 17% of the 100% of cases were categorized as Hispanic/Latino, which equates to a total of 26 cases of the 154.
And then what is the 26%?
The 26% is race/ethnicity unknown.
Oh, okay. And 35%, that's white, Caucasian.
White, not Hispanic origin.
And the 12, is that
Yes.
African American?
Correct. Black, not Hispanic origin.
All right. Okay.
So figure 5 shows the housing statuses of respondents. Counties reported that almost half of the housing statuses of respondents were unhoused. Unhoused respondents were 46% of, or 71 of the 154 total number of cases. About a quarter of the respondents were in permanent housing, and the smallest percentage of housing statuses of respondents is institutional housing. Figure 6 shows the legal resolutions for closed cases. Of the 154 cases that were filed, 23 were closed, so the counties did not provide legal representation for these cases. The most common legal resolution was no qualifying severe mental illness, followed by case dismissed for any other reason. And this 23 number corresponds to the first chart, the shaded region of the first chart.
The way I interpret this, because a court can dismiss a petition for failure to establish a qualifying severe mental illness before it ever gets to the appointment of counsel stage. So the way I'm sort of interpreting, and this is, I maybe need to confirm this, for these 8, that actually did go on to be appointed to a public defender's office or QLSP is that post-appointment it came to light that the mental health issues were insufficient to trigger the care court process. But usually I think that that's actually caught before appointment is made.
On this table, this displays the live trainings and technical assistance provided by the Office of the State Public Defender. In total, the Office of the State Public Defender held 4 live trainings on the topics of disability rights and housing. In total, 75 participants from QLSPs and public defender offices attended. OSPD, or Office of the State Public Defender, also provided both brief and in-depth technical assistance to QLSPs and public defender offices. In-depth technical assistance was provided in the area of immigration. And this is actually my last slide and concludes the presentation for this agenda item. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Well, on the slide you previously showed the closed cases.
Mhm.
Okay, so these are cases that were resolved before the creation of a care plan. Is that right?
Correct.
So what about, okay, but so the rest of the cases have care plans, or I'm trying to figure out if anybody's being helped by this.
Yeah, so there were a total of 154 cases that the counties reported for Q1, and these 23 cases, petitions were filed, but Chris, and correct me if I'm wrong, it would mean that petitions were filed, but at the first hearing, or perhaps the judge might have dismissed the case.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
these are essentially cases that were dismissed early. So I
all right,
think
so we
the
so we
remaining
have
cases.
yeah, so we have 154 minus 23 cases that are still pending.
Yeah, they're still open, which means they're probably beginning, they're in the phase of negotiating for a care plan or agreement, or a care plan agreement has been reached, but then the case stays open for, I think it stays open for up to a year, and then it can be like reappointed at the end of the year if it needs more time. So though if the case is still open, so not these cases, it would be reasonable to infer that most or all of them are going into care plans and agreements, and will stay open until the respondent quote unquote graduates from the agreement or plan.
So, okay, so you have 154 minus 23 for the first quarter.
That's 131 open cases.
131, if you multiply, and you know, it's maybe not great to multiply that by 4 because LA was only open for a month, but if you did, that would be like 500 or so cases for a year that might be open across the whole state. Well, it's interesting. It may take a while for this program to ramp up. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, and I know it's probably way too early to ask for this, but just at the end of the day, I mean, what I would want to know is like, what's happening in these cases that are actually open and pending, and like, is anybody being helped by this?
I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I was wondering.
Well, I don't
Laura,
expect.
I was gonna say Laura Brown from the Judicial Council might have, and Laura, if you're like, nope, I'm not at liberty to describe that. I was gonna say you might have actually heard a little more than us about sort of, maybe from the court side, how the care plans or agreements are they being like slow to start? Is it promising? How's it looking? And if you know you don't have that information, that's perfectly fine.
Well, I
Actually-
think I'll defer to Melanie because she's actually been on several site visits, so she would have more information than me.
Oh,
Okay,
I
Melanie?
missed that Melanie
Which
joined.
is
Hi, Melanie.
exactly what I was going to say. So I think that although there's some push at the state level, you know, gosh, we were hoping to see hundreds of thousands of cases by now. First of all, you have to realize it wasn't really a whole year, right? The first court started in October, followed by, and there are only 7 that started in October, followed by Los Angeles that started in December. So I do think that getting the word out, getting the right word out is challenging. There's been an awful lot of work being done to get people, and we're somehow not really counting this number, but we're seeing this in the self-help center a fair amount, which is people come in and they're saying, you know, my person with substance abuse disorder, my person with bipolar disorder, and they don't qualify. But they are still being connected to mental health, and they are still getting services, and those are not being reflected in these numbers. And secondly, I think that what the courts are seeing and what the courts are happy about is that people are taking their time. This is not a population that we're going to be able to serve a notice to and have them come in. It takes a great deal of effort on the part of behavioral health and the others to go out to these where these people are found and to convince them that this is good for them. So we're hearing some really great stories. I can tell you about one that the homeless outreach group, who are the first ones who go out in Los Angeles, made up of two young ladies who one has lived experience herself and one has family with lived experience, and they've both been members of NAMI, and now they are professionals working in this arena for the mental health departments. But they've gone out and for instance, one was talking about how the family has taught their respondent who is suffering to go to the bathroom. Whenever anybody comes to the door, they have to go hide in the bathroom. And that's how they proceed. And so these workers came in, and they, again, every day they're coming back and they're saying, can we talk to you some more? And by the end of their 2 weeks, he walked them to the door. And that was just huge. And that's not something you're going to see reflected here, but it's such a win. They're also talking about, you know, going out into the streets, coming back with their hamburgers every day, with the water, getting people to talk about more services. Another piece that we're hearing about is that family members want to file petitions, and because of HIPAA, and because maybe they don't have the best relationship with their respondent, the respondent's already receiving services. The family just doesn't know that. So again, these are some of the things that are coming up. And as far as the judges are concerned, they are really taking a careful and carefully thought out approach. And they are just giving as much time and as much leeway, but making sure that services are happening, making sure that progress is being made. So although it feels a little bit slow in the numbers, I feel like there's just a positive feeling about the progress. We haven't seen a lot of first responders, so that's an interesting new area that we'll need to work on some more about getting people to file petitions. And again, it's the start, and it's 8 counties. So hopefully when we go live with the remaining 50 counties in a few more months here, we'll be able to see a real pattern. I feel like right now we haven't seen anything that we could measure as a pattern. So I hope that's helpful.
No, that's great. I really appreciate that. We need to hear more about more of that stuff, kind of on the ground, real stories. I think that's terrific. And your comment makes me wonder whether it would be possible to invite a care court judge to come to our session in April. I don't know whether that's possible or whether anybody would be interested, but I would find it interesting.
I think the committee can invite whomever it likes. We'll explore that with you, Eric. I'll put it in the notes.
Yeah, I think there's especially the first judges that are starting in cohort 1. Gosh, they've just been so fabulous and really engaged. And if not there, I could help you, Chris. There's another judge that you might want to talk to out of Sacramento, Judge Brown. But I could help you with that if you want.
I can't obviously speak for this judge's availability, but I attended a meeting of cohort 1 agencies recently, including county public defender's offices, superior courts, and the judge overseeing care court in San Francisco went out of his way to make a point that he thought the QLSPs serving San Francisco were doing an absolutely phenomenal job because other counties don't have QLSPs representing respondents there. And he's like, just so you all know, if you get a QLSP in 24-25, like they're knocking it out of the park in San Francisco. So, he's like, I know I was like, maybe he'd be a good person to ask.
And Helen, thanks for that report. Appreciate it.
Of course. Chris, if I may, I can move on to item 4.2.
Great. And this is like our last agenda item. Thank you, Helen.
All right. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Great. Right, so now I'll present on agenda item 4.2, update on the 2024 Care Court convening. First, I'll be sharing a summary of the convening goals and attendance, and then I'll provide an update on the programming. On February 13th, the State Bar hosted a half-day convening for Cohort 1 and Cohort 2 stakeholders from 9:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. The primary goal was to help QLSPs, support centers, public defender offices, and other entities implement their roles under the CARE Act and/or the Budget Act of 2023. A total of 111 representatives from QLSPs, support centers, public defender offices, and other entities attended. Of those 111 representatives, 52 attended in person and 59 attended remotely. Representation included 3 statewide entities, which were the Judicial Council of California, the Office of the State Public Defender, which is also a grantee, and the State Bar. 7 out of 8 of the counties from Cohort 1 and Los Angeles County attended, as well as 19 counties from Cohort 2, which included Alameda, Nevada, Yuba, and San Bernardino counties. The convening included 2 panels, a training and a small group discussion. The first panel was implementing a QLSP and public defender model in San Francisco County. Representatives from the 2 QLSPs and public defender offices serving San Francisco shared their advice on how to prepare for and collaborate in the mutual role of Respondents Council. The second panel was exploring different ways to implement the CARE Act for QLSPs, public defender offices, and support centers and other entities. The panel explored how different entities in Cohort 1 and Los Angeles have implemented the CARE Act. Panelists discussed how they navigate this new court program in their distinct geographies and shared their implementation strategies. Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund presented a training about centering accessibility and autonomy in care courts, where attendees planning for their potential or their continued role as Respondents Council learned about representing respondents who have severe mental health issues. Attendees also broke out into small group discussions during the lunch period and chose between 4 topics. Those 4 topics were implementing CARE Act roles, navigating the care process, engaging with respondents, and advocating for a care plan or agreements. Based on our post-convening survey, attendees rated the training with the highest, with 75% of the survey respondents rating the program as high or very high in helpfulness. And the most requested topics for future programming was strategies to engage care respondents, supporters, and volunteers. The Office of...
I'm so sorry, I thought you were done. I'm going to hold my thought till you're done.
Oh, I was just reading the last bullet point. The Office of the State Public Defender also presented on its resources for Respondents Council.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that, Helen.
No
I was
worries.
just going to say for the commissioners who might be new to the commission this year, Disability Rights Education Defense Fund, or DREDF, is a Legal Services Trust Fund Commission grantee. It is a qualified support center. It did not receive funding to provide legal training technical assistance to Respondents Council for this year. It didn't apply for it, but it's still, like, this is obviously within their wheelhouse. And so they have done care court trainings for the Judicial Council of California, and so we invited them to do this And they did a really good job.
Thanks, Chris. Lastly, we wanted to share a few photos from the convening. The two photos on the left are views of the LA conference rooms of the attendees. The top right photo is our first panel, and the bottom right photo is from the training. And this
See in
concludes
the
it.
top right, it's I mean, ignore me, but it's a representative from LAE, a representative from JDC, the two QLSP serving San Francisco, and then representative from the San Francisco County Public Defender's Office. And then in the bottom right are the two speakers from DREDF doing the training.
Thanks, Chris. And this concludes agenda item 4.2. I'm happy to answer any questions.
And if there are none, that concludes the agenda for today's meeting.
All right, well, any further comments from anybody?
No,
All
just
right,
a
I'll give
thanks.
you, oh yeah, sorry, Efren, did you want to say something?
No, I was just gonna say just a thanks as always for the good reports, but to you as well, Eric, for the discussion. That was good. And I like that we now are considering a presentation.
Yeah, good idea from you to do all that. All right, well, we're going to give you 12 minutes back of your day. How about that?
Wonderful.
No
And staff
objection.
will connect with you, Eric, next week about guest speakers for April.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.